Okay, but I'll read it. Interpretation
Okay.
connects symbols, concepts, many to many. Concepts are connected in the feature lattice with distinction relationships. A distinction states that a specific concept differs from a more abstract concept because of a claim which is only true for a specific concept. And then we have two relationships between concepts. It's if you have two specific concepts and a more generic one, is the, okay, two specific concepts that could be interpreted from a symbol. And the question is the more generic one also a plausible interpretation of the symbol? Then we're speaking about nuance. Where, it's a generic specific, and we could mean either, but we could also mean both. And sometimes we would not generally ever mean both, like the Paris, France and Paris Hilton. It's one or the other. We'll rarely ever want to be ambiguous about it. And then it's homonymy. So that's a distinction we've been saying many times, but we got more formal about it yesterday and got kind of alignment on it, if I'm not mistaken. I just wanted to bring you up to date on that. But I had an epiphany this morning, which I'd like to discuss.
Yeah, I found the message. Thank you.
I realized all these formal statements are also symbols, which should be obvious. But that means that when we're
sorry to interject, but what are these formal statements? And check whether to see whether my microphone works. Apparently it does. Great.
When we're speaking a lot about making canonical forms of statements as frames with references to their entities or variables representing entity constraints. This is the formalization end of argument representation or even claim representation. And these formalized statements, these formalized claims, I thought of them mostly as living in the concept end, but I realized no, they're symbols like anything else. And that means the good thing about that is that if I have a mechanism for saying, oh, this symbol, string of text, can be interpreted as many concepts, can be the concept can evolve, and all these notions, I can apply them also to the formalizations. The formalizations are interpretable. They can have multiple interpretations, usually based on interpretation of underlying entity, but it's still true, and even sometimes not. You can speak about equivalence classes, and that's what we were saying about non-obvious equivalence yesterday. Is the Earth exactly like an approximate sphere or approximately like an exact sphere? That's equivalent. So there's.
I think I understand what you're getting at. So let me try to paraphrase here.
Sure.
And I think it gets to the heart in some differences in how we approach things. When I call something incremental formalization, I think in your terminology, you could say that I start out with symbols, let's say a claim, that's just a piece of text. Absolutely. And then true. Indeed that can be interpreted as, and then you can start attaching formal definitions to it, etc.
Yep.
And yeah, for me, that was always the case, because that's, for me, what incremental formalization means is you start with just a symbol. You don't add extra formalism on top of just saying this is a claim.
That's also true for me, by the way.
Okay.
That I don't think that's a difference.
But is this what is the epiphany then that you had?
That even the formalizations are symbols and are subject to the interpretation relation.
Well, so yes. So when I talk about a general to specific relationship between claims, and I always said a claim can be whatever. In our lengthy discussions we had about usable claim, that can include formalizations. I always said, yeah, the claim, its symbol, and some additional formalizations as a whole can be interpreted as something more specific, right? So I think that was always on the table. So for me, that's not I think that's always what I was aiming at with the definition of claim as is.
Okay, fair enough. It may not be new to you. I'm just thinking, okay, here's the thing. I've been wavering and going back and forth on, do I want to materialize concepts? Or do I just say, oh, it's an equivalence class of symbols, and I can attach all the information to the symbol, saying, well, actually, this symbol is represented by this other symbol, and the equivalence, like the distinguished representation.
Can you give an example? Class. Because all of these are very abstract. So, like, do you have a specific scenario in mind? Because I mean, probably depends on the scenario. And in general, I would say I would materialize things that are disagreement on. That's what I always say. You add formalism where formalism is needed because there's disagreement on it.
No, that is not what I mean. Okay. I'm speaking, this is an implementation conversation right now, first.
Okay.
I agree totally. We have symbols and we may discover that there's a disagreement on the symbol after the fact, and then we do at need formalization. That's not the issue here. Mm-hmm. The issue is, okay, each symbol phrase has many interpretations, right? And that means even the phrase that is chosen as the representative of the equivalence class may have many interpretations, mm-hmm. including outside of its equivalence class. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of, for that distinguished representative, there's two ways I can use it. I can use it as a distinguished representative of the equivalence class, and then I mean just the equivalence class, which has some clear definitions. I've attached these constraints to these definitional claims, okay? Mm-hmm. Or there's as a pure symbol, and then I have to look at all its interpretations, which will include other equivalence classes.
These are two separate concepts. I mean, this is composition. What you call the equivalence class is composed out of something else, which is what you call, and these are two different entities. They need different names.
Exactly. And the equivalence class is what I call concept, and the right, and the phrase as such is what I call the symbol. And when I say I interpret a symbol as a concept, it means I interpret symbol as an equivalence class. And what we show people are, when we show the phrase as the phrase, but when we show a symbol is usually the concept, we usually show the distinguished representative, which is also a phrase, but we have to show.
That's where I disagree, and that's why these user stories and picking entities are so important. If you're going to show a user a symbol using your terminology, and only a symbol, and you don't clarify to the user that that symbol represents a concept, as you call it, that's going to be highly problematic.
Exactly what I was saying.
You're breaking the representation of the concepts, and that's why it's so important that the user understands these entities that you face them with.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was saying. I want to show that there's no contradiction there. I was saying I will represent it also as a symbol, but I want to say here the symbol is used as a representative of a concept and not as just a raw symbol.
But if you look at concrete user stories, I mean, what would happen is inside of articles, if you look as a web author, I want to annotate my article, blah, 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 there it will be a symbol. But what the symbol may be linking to is an interpretation of what you would call a concept.
Exactly.
And okay.
Now, for me, most claims would have started their life as more on the symbol side and not more as a concept side and not on the symbol side. But now I'm realizing, no, they, just like anything else, just like natural language, they live on both sides of the divide. There's the formal representation as a symbol and the formal, and that's how I can do equivalence classes on formal representations. And that is my morning's epiphany. That should have been obvious, maybe it was obvious to you, but it's
my intuition is it was, but I don't use the same terminology and abstractions as you do. So for me, again, I work in the concrete, I work on claims. And for me, yes, whether or not claims are formalized, I would call it, whether or not claims contain additional formalized semantics, the base operation for me of generalizations and all that stuff always happens on a claim level.
And when you say claim, do you think you're meaning symbol or concept in my terminology? Because I'm not sure I follow what you're saying.
Symbol, because concept comes close to something I've been trying to introduce before, is canonical claim. I think for me, a usable claim, if you look at our definition, doesn't have equivalence of multiple claims. It only is the thing. We can pull up the definition, right? But I think you know it by heart. There's no equivalence clause in usable claim.
Right. Each usable claim should hopefully be distinct. For me, there's equivalence class in usable claims because, for example, I may have the same claim using different languages, different formalisms. So no,
because we actually highlighted that as examples of usable claim, that different languages are separate usable claims. We can go through the examples, but it's clearly listed as separate usable claims. For me, that's already on a high level of abstraction we haven't even tried to define yet, but I think that's what we're working towards.
Okay, interesting. So do you have a concept of an equivalence class of usable claims, for example, that would bring together different languages, different formalisms?
I'd call it probably canonical claim. It's the closest to what I think people mean by canonical claim in these discussions.
Okay, cool. So fair enough. So I think your canonical claim is close to my concept, except of course I include entities. And
yeah, and I'm even okay with that abstraction there, but just it helps when reasoning about this to use more specific.
No, but yeah, we're relying on vocabularies here. and I think your usable claim is what I'm calling the distinguished representative of the equivalence class.
No, because it's more akin to the symbol. Because it's not assigned a distinguishable representative. It may be as part of a concept.
Which one is more akin to the symbol?
A representative distinguishing symbol, but by itself.
Yours or mine is more akin to the symbol. Sorry.
When I see a relation between which terminology am I using? Mine or yours?
That's what I was asking you.
So in my own words, it's easy. I'll first say it in my words. In my own words, we need something like a canonical claim that is an equivalence class of usable claims. Yes. And one of those usable claims is chosen as the distinguishing representative.
Okay, got it.
Even if you go multilingual, you probably want multiple distinguishing representatives for each different language. But we haven't really discussed and defined these things, but more or less loosely, that lives on the abstraction, on the entity level of what I would call a canonical claim.
Okay, so what you're saying, and that feels right to me, is that there may be non-distinguished representative usable claims, which sounds right. We might, and the distinguished representatives of an equivalence class will be a subset of the usable claims, a strict subset of the usable claims.
I'm saying that when you're looking at an entity from the perspective of a usable claim, you don't pull in any distinguishing representative effects. A usable claim can even be the distinguishing representative of multiple canonical claims to be discussed. But
yeah, no, there I think it's the notion of distinguished representative for me requires that it points to only one canonical claim. That's the point of distinguishing.
I probably agree, but just purely from the point is you're talking about different entities, and when you're talking about usable claims, you're not talking about canonical claims. So there's no such concept as distinguishing representative. That's what I mean. A usable claim can be used as part in the context of a canonical claim as a distinguishing representative.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But that doesn't mean that what makes it a distinguishing representative is part of a canonical claim. It's not tied to the concept of a usable claim.
Right. I
agree with the other parts that it probably makes perfect sense. I have to think about this, but that the usable claim is only used as a distinguishing representative in one canonical claim. I probably agree with that.
Good. Okay, so we're pretty close actually. No, there's a lot of definition work to do still, but I think we're getting close to that as schema. It's just that for me, formal was living squarely at the in the concept realm, and that was a mistake. And
Yes, I agree. If that was what you thought, I agree, because formal definitely needs to live in the symbol realm as well.
yeah, yep. This is now very clear and obvious and necessary to me. Okay, excellent. So what we're dealing with then is, so interpretation from symbols, including non-usable claims, by the way, to canonical claims, aka concepts, and some usable claims chosen as distinguished representatives of any concept. And ideally, we won't bother to create concepts out of non-usable claims. We'll just interpret them as a usable claim first, use that as
yes, actually part of this rings a bell. I've always been against indeed creating canonical claims without having any usable claims. And I think there was always this notion in the past that, but it's there, it represents some concept, but the concept doesn't have any meaning if there's no usable claims linked to it, or if there's no symbols whatsoever linked to it. What shapes the concept is exactly the symbols linked to it.
Yeah, in terms of progressive formalization, I would tend to allow creating a concept without having the usable claim first.
But what is that? Can you give an example of that operation? Because I can't imagine it.
Because what I can do is I can take a contextual claim and say this claim, it's indexical, it's all kinds of things, but I'm still making it into a concept. And as we will make the usable claim later by referring to the context.
Wait. Okay, let's dig into this. So a contextual claim here is what? It's a fragment.
It's a fragment taken from a
source.
document. Yeah, exactly.
So at this point, it's not a claim yet. It's a piece of text or okay. And what do you want to do with that? I want to
put it, hello, Tim. This may be hard to follow. We're deep in a conversation where Stephen and I have been aligning vocabularies.
We're trying to right now figure out whether there are use cases where but then we first need to summarize what a canonical claim is.
Okay.
Just give me the overview in one sentence, and then I'll follow what you're trying to say.
Okay, we've been aligning vocabularies. It seems that I've been saying all along concepts are equivalence class of symbols, and it seems that Stephen is also thinking of canonical claims as equivalence classes. And so his notion of canonical claim is aligned to. And I had the epiphany, I always thought that formal claims, like in terms of frames and this and that, were more on the side of concepts. And I realized, no, they're symbols like any others, like any piece of text. And as such, they're subject to the same notion of interpretation, equivalence class, and so on. I mean, we were saying yesterday that, for example, some equivalences are non-trivial, like exactly like an imperfect round ball or approximately like a perfect round ball, you know. So there's non-trivial equivalence. So even with formal claims, there's equivalence class unification, which makes sense. And that means being attached to formal representations is something we use to define concepts, but it's not, that doesn't mean that these things are not symbols first before they become concepts. And the other part of the conversation is when we show a concept to the user, we'll probably do so in the form of a distinguished representative symbol. There can be many, for example, one per language, one per formalization. But those should be ideally usable claims. And now I said, well, in the interest of progressive formalization, it is possible to use a contextual, indexical, non-usable claim as a claim, put it in the system and say, well, there's a concept behind this, even if I haven't written down the usable claim form yet.
So, and I was trying to dig into what the last sentence meant, because I'm not certain it's even a claim yet at that point. And if it is, then, but I was just trying to understand the last sentence. But so in short, we're trying to find use cases of equivalence classes of claims, which you could call canonical claim for this discussion, where there are no
Usable claim in
equivalence
the class
relations.
yet.
There's only the placeholders that something will become an equivalence class, essentially.
Yeah, no, it's a singleton equivalence class. That I don't
Singleton,
think
in
that
what sense?
it has a single representative at first.
Oh, it does.
Yeah, the non-usable
but then-
claim I would allow to be part of the equivalence class.
Okay, but it does contain something, but it's not okay. Because concepts for you are entities and claims. Can we just, to make this discussion easier, only consider claims for now, only entities, but let's consider the
Let's
specific.
forget entities for now. It's good enough.
Yeah, so
Sure.
if you have an equivalence class of claims,
Yeah.
what type of claim are we talking about here?
That's the point. It's a generic claim, and that means
What is a
well,
generic claim?
It's claim without any adjective in the glossary. That means it's
No.
not necessarily usable. It's not necessarily.
I can
It could
screen
be,
share.
Yes.
But a claim without any adjective is more of our conceptual claim, what it should be. Because if you look at matches definition, all of these are claims. Does not match definition, or like, so this is more like a concept. So are you saying that this is indeed we know that that claim in there matches these definitions? It's like the pie is delicious, but it's
well,
never going to be.
We said we were restricting ourselves to claim, so I'm restricting myself to claim. I could.
Yeah, but which
not do
claim?
that.
That's my question.
And I said unqualified claim.
So whatever.
No, yeah, certainly I want to include.
This is the problem I was pointing out before, is we never came up with a name for the superset, the higher abstraction of contributed claim and acceptable claim. And we know that one transfers into the other, but we don't have a word for the superset that includes both of them.
I think we call it system claim at some point, but I'm not certain that's even the one that Marc-Antoine means right now. But I think we call it system claim. Information that was submitted to the system as a domain type claim. Claim here being the conceptual goal, which is either a candidate, accepted, or rejected.
Okay, maybe that's right. Maybe that's right. Except I'm suddenly curious about the status of contextual claims. Contextual claims are claims, right?
We haven't defined contextual claims, and part of the problem was exactly that we don't know whether they're claims or not yet. But that's why we left the last discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
And my last question, trying to understand what you meant by that sentence, was exactly what do you mean by that last sentence? Just like claim is sometimes undefined, contextual claim is even more undefined.
Yeah, no, I'm realizing we're stumbling on the fact that we don't yet know it's a claim, and frankly, I don't give a damn.
So it doesn't matter indeed. Just talk specific. So you have
a fragment.
A fragment on a media source. What do you want to do with that?
Supposing... I want to put it in the system and say, okay, this is something of interest. And I think it will, I'm saying, not I think, it automatically, there's a symbol, there's the equivalence class of that symbol auto-created. There's a corresponding concept created. But right now, the equivalence class is only that thing alone because it has
the equivalent class between which entities. What is the user trying to do?
This is not a user operation. First, this is, in the sense, putting the fragment in the system is a user operation. But after that, saying in the system,
which system for which purpose is the user putting in a fragment? That's essentially what is the entity? Like, what is the goal here? What is the...
Okay, the user is putting the fragment in any of the systems listed, any system in.
So as a fragment, let's keep calling it a fragment because we don't know anything else. So the user adds a fragment to the system. Okay.
Yeah. And implicitly, without user action, the fragment creates two entities at the data representation level.
Mm-hmm.
One is the fragment, and the other is the equivalence class containing the fragment, the concept of the fragment.
Fair enough. So there's an equivalence clause of fragments, but there's only one contained fragment in that equivalence clause between fragments.
Yeah, and that's why I said it's a singleton.
Okay. So does it ever make sense to have equivalence clauses between fragments? I would say no. I'm not interested. Okay, can you give me a use case where the equivalence clause of a fragment is useful?
It's because I'm trying to build proper canonical claims or canonical entities.
But with fragments, we're talking about fragments right now.
Yes,
not claims.
That's correct. But the claim, the fragment is likely to be identified as a claim or an entity or something.
I can give an example. Here. And you know, we've talked about evidence, and in the canonical debate, you want to provide a fragment as evidence for something, right? So you
that's
say
a different operation, but then we can talk about.
Wait. I'm giving the context of an example here, which is that you know, you may say this web page here clearly shows that somebody did something. And that's submitted as evidence. That claim that fragment shows somebody doing something, right, is itself a debatable claim. So it's a claim that references a fragment as part of its construction.
I don't see how that's an equivalence clause. I mean, I'm following you, but
I'm not done. Right. Now we want claims to be equivalent. And one way to automatically do that is if you have two claims with slightly different structures with different definitions, but you have an equivalence class between definitions, you can detect that two claims are equivalent because you've changed some definitions, but their definitions are equivalent.
Yeah, of course. But yes, but this is not an equivalence clause between fragments. It's an equivalence clause between definitions.
A fragment is something that specifies an externally linkable something or externally referenceable something with a reference, right? But what if you change? Can you have reference the same thing twice, two different ways? Well, a URL, for example, can have different query parameters and be separate URLs, but actually the content they return is equivalent. So essentially you have a different references. And you can create two different fragments that have different references, but they're actually referencing the equivalent data.
So now we're getting to the core of what a fragment is. So you're saying a fragment is some technical mechanism to retrieve something, and what is retrieved, the equivalence of that can be determined with another fragment that retrieves it with some different, let's call it a locator for now. I think we used that before. So fragments have a locator and return some bytes, let's say, some content, and an equivalence clause of fragments would be.
I'm using the fragment as here with evidence. I used the URL as an example, but the way we defined fragments so far was more generic. But isn't it equivalent to say, you know, the Communist Manifesto, page 32, paragraph 3, sentence 5? Another way to say it might be the same manifesto, page 33, the same page, second to last paragraph, last two sentences. So I've used a different reference, but I'm actually referring to the same sentences, right? So in that case, you might register the same thing twice, not be able to detect automatically the same thing, but
so granted, I'd agree that would be an equivalence clause between fragments that I wouldn't want. I want different fragments, but yes, if that's what a fragment is to you, and fragments can be that vague and non-specific, then yes, there is use for equivalence clause of those types of fragments. Digital fragments.
The reason I would want equivalent classes in that sense is I see fragments as being a type of entity that makes up a claim. That's you know, as if it were a definition, but instead of the definition being words, the concept is this fragment.
But I'm not against fragments conceptually. I'm against your notion of the purpose of equivalence clauses between fragments presupposes a way you're gonna store fragments. I wouldn't, in any system that I create, I wouldn't have free-form text fragments. If you do that, I'm on board with, yes, the equivalence clauses between fragments will make sense. But I would shortcut that. I wouldn't have free-form text.
But that's not what I'm talking about, by the way. It's valid, it's relevant, but it's not what I'm talking about. And let's see if I can persuade you of the different use case I have in mind.
But so yeah, in that case, what you were trying to convince me of was, does it make sense to start an equivalence class with only one thing in there? So yes, this would be one. Even though I don't agree with the user story, but yes, if you want that user story, yes, that's an example.
For me, the question is, all equivalence classes are created by aggregation, right? We start with something which we believe is distinct, and then we find, oh, it's the same as this, same as that, and then we create the equivalence class. And that way we can start with any fragment. We don't even know, or we haven't told the system whether it's a claim or an entity or garbage, or, you know.
I think you always do. You never add just, I think that's my main point here. You never just add whatever to the system.
Okay, fair. That's not really the point. Okay, but you could be wrong. Okay, let's say you say it's a claim, fine.
Then what are the constraints of a claim in the system you're adding it to? And then we're going to contributed claim, etc.
No. That's exactly. It's submitted, right? It's, you claim it's a claim. It's a submitted claim. It hasn't been approved.
Yeah, but even as the submission process has constraints, I'm not talking about acceptance, whether or not it's a well-formed claim and all that stuff. I'm talking about what is a claim. Is it a piece of text? Is it which formalisms is it allowed to have, etc.
Right.
In the case of a fragment, I'm talking about, is it a URL? Is it a specific type of W3C URL? Is it a can it be any URL? Can it be, like, I'm talking concretely about what it is physically that you can submit to the system. That is constrained by the entity types.
And what I'm saying is fragments, that is, you know, a piece of text that is explicitly linked to a context. You know, it comes from a document, it has a link back to the document. And that means it allows this claim to not be indexable.
Is it a claim or a fragment? Because you interchange fragment claim quite, that's part, if it's a fragment, call it a fragment. Once it becomes a claim, we'll see how it becomes a claim. But as long as it's a fragment, please call it a fragment.
I'm waffling because you're attacking me on both sides. But let's say now I come in and say, okay, I think this is a claim. I think this fragment, and I think it's a claim. Okay.
But what are you adding to the system as a fragment or as a claim?
I'm saying as a fragment submitted as probably a claim. It's we called it. We had a name for it. Sorry, I'm looking for the submitted claim. Yes. But what I'm saying is submitted claim could be contextual as opposed to just a piece of text, which is
yes, and I think that's the action you're talking about here. If I think we dig deeper into this, you're talking about adding a contextual claim linked to a canonical claim, or linked to a usable claim at the very least. I think that operation you're describing here does a lot of things. It's pulling out a fragment from a media source.
Yes.
It's adding an interpretation from that fragment as a usable claim.
That's
it's adding
later.
a usable claim.
That's later. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say I can put it in the system as a fragment, as a knowingly unusable claim, put it in the system and say it's unusable. I know it's unusable, but I want it an equivalence class, or I want it to be in the system. I want it to be a system claim, even if I know it's unusable.
Could it be then okay, if we're talking, I think, pretty much about what is a contextual claim or what can it be? It sounds like you're arguing that you can add fragments as contributed claims with or as contributed contextual claims that have an unset usable claim. So there's only the fragment.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay. But do you see that it's not just adding a claim to the system, it's adding a fragment, it's adding what we're defining now, contextual claim, and it's implying that there will also at some point be a usable claim. But it seems like
it will be an unusable claim to which I will associate a usable claim, a different usable claim in the equivalence class.
Yeah, but do you see that calling all of these claim or just
No,
That's part of the problem. There's a whole workflow, a whole step of processes in between here that you're
what you're
implying.
saying is perfectly accurate, but it does not invalidate my original statement. I'm still adding a claim to the system.
You're doing more than that, and that
Yes, I am, but that doesn't
can,
invalidate my original statement.
in a way, you're not adding a claim to the system because, like you said, no usable claim added to the system. There's only, depending on how you model
I
it,
never
there's
said
only
usable
a fragment
claim.
and a contextual
I just said claim. I didn't say usable claim.
Yes, and we're trying to align
I
on
think,
what it is you're adding.
Can I interject? The way I've kind of been looking at it is that if you don't have a human, for lack of a better word, like a person who's sort of affirmatively engaged in this process, then you can't for sure say that a particular fragment is a claim, is my opinion. Like, because you just don't know what the author intended. You're interpreting what the author may have intended, but only the author could really have intended. And that's why a person using any annotation tool, they can make that step of interpretation, but they can't speak for the author necessarily. And so that's why I think, if I understand correctly, that's why I'd agree on this point. Not that I think that there's vast disagreement, but on this point, I think I would agree with Stephen, which is that you can't add a claim basically from a fragment. You can add a fragment, but we don't know what the author might have said the claim was in that fragment. We're just saying, look, this text appeared there. And then if you want to do more to that, then it's that user, that human's act of interpretation. They might say, I think this fragment proves this other claim that I'm either writing or I'm finding in the system. Or they might say, I think that this fragment is an appearance of this claim, which might have its own connections with things. But that's where I've kind of come down to recently is, these fragments, or citations, we're going to call them excerpts. They come in, and then either they can be used as support or evidence for claims, or they can be, it can be said that claims are appearing in them. But both of those are, acts of interpretation that the human user of the system is adding. That's how I was thinking about it.
The Kyle, just to answer to that, and we're almost at the end of the hour. I agree and disagree. Okay, first, I agree we cannot speak for the author, but I think when we speak about interpretation, we very explicitly allow reader interpretation to factor in. So if I interpret a fragment as a claim, that doesn't mean it is a claim, but I don't think it is a claim is a meaningful sentence. This can be interpreted as a claim. Now, of course, we can have acceptance criteria. So do we agree, do most people agree this can be interpreted as a claim, community process, whatever. But the notion of interpreted as a claim is a meaningful thing in and of itself. And author intent is a separate thing. So that's one thing.
I think we don't disagree there.
Yeah, but I don't think, I didn't hear this in what Carl was saying. And
I did actually.
Okay. And the other thing
Tim's mentioned, it would be a cool thing is if the author could come to the system and say, oh yeah, that is the claim that I intended to there. So
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
cool.
But the interesting thing there is, what is claim referring to? My main pet peeve is, but I mean, you more or less conceded that I'm not saying it's a specific claim. You're saying it's a zebra, whatever, right? It's not a usable claim. I think I'm saying.
I said all the time, it may not be a usable claim.
Okay, exactly.
I was very clear about that.
Yes. I think this whole process I would call a contextual, adding a contextual claim. And then what you're arguing for is that a contextual claim doesn't necessarily need to contain a usable claim.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
That's one thing I'm saying. But I'll go further. Actually, I conceded for the sake of moving the conversation forward, that it makes sense when I'm adding a fragment to say, I think this is a claim and I'm entering it as a claim candidate, even if it's not a usable claim candidate. But I think it would be a valid use case to allow people to enter a fragment and say, I'm not sure this is a claim or an entity or whatever. I think it's important and interesting, and we should decide what it is. So I think entering a fragment as this represents something and to be analyzed, I think is a valid use case, but it's a separate use case.
It aligns with your whole, because what I got out of the meeting yesterday is you really, all the use cases that operate on that level, and the really fundamental low level fragments, concept and entity level, it's like some global web annotation layer, I would call it.
Yep, correct.
And in that light, yes.
Global what?
So like suppose that you, as a user, you want to see annotations from any people or sub-communities you're interested in. You want to highlight, oh, what have other people highlighted in this document as something they attach additional semantics to, meaning like maybe they attach a definition to a word in a document. Like
it's semantic annotation. It's not just annotation.
Yeah, semantic annotation. I think that's the level of user stories that Marc-Antoine wants to support. He's talking about.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, I'm interested in those.
And then the open question is whether or not a claim annotation system should or should not build on top of such a semantic web annotation. But just being able to delineating the scope of these two is, I think, progress, which came out of yesterday's meeting.
Yep.
And I think we agree, right? But it's just the reason for these glossary terms and not just saying, oh, how did you summarize again just now, that you can add a fragment as a claim. Make specific which claim you mean, because it's not a usable claim.
But the abstract superclass I was meaning the ambiguous abstract superclass as a concept.
We don't have an abstract superclass. We don't have a
definition. No, that's what claim is. That's what the word claim is. We even have consensus on it.
We don't, Marc-Antoine. Let me show you the abstract superclass you're referring to again. If it's this one, I strongly disagree that the use case you just described adds this type of claim. A fragment as this type of claim. This does nothing. You can add a fragment that's not a declarative sentence, right?
Yes, but that's a separate case. I said there's two use cases. There's one where I enter a fragment that is anything and I say it's anything, and there's one where I enter a fragment and I say, yeah, this is probably a claim. I may be wrong about it. That's another story.
Yeah, but we have a different word for that, and that's what we call system claim.
Yeah.
Marc-Antoine, you're saying that you want to capture the intention, right? Of the author.
Yeah. Well, in some use cases you do, in some cases you don't. But system, and the reason I hesitated to use system claim is I wasn't sure that system claim included what I call contextual claim or fragment claims.
You are defining contextual claim is what I'm arguing. You're saying that you want to add a contextual claim.
So we're not done defining it, but I still need to use it.
No, but it's not the general abstract claim. When you say you want to use it to add a fragment as a claim, you're denoting a new type of claim. I would call a contextual claim, which has an optional usable claim from what I hear you say. You might not instantly want to define what we call a usable claim when adding a fragment as a contextual claim to be defined, but the point is that at a later point in time, you might want to attach a usable claim to that contextual claim. The other point is adding a fragment as a contextual claim, as you define right now, entails an act of interpretation. There is somebody, okay. So a contextual claim also, in addition, it's not an abstract broad claim. It's a claim that actually has an associated interpretation, which
and I'm saying the act of, however, I'm saying the act of interpretation can be delayed. When we say,
by the act of interpretation, you mean assigning a usable claim, but it's still, there's someone there.
Yep, I agree. And there's someone there.
So this thing that you said is this abstract broad claim turns out to be something fairly specific, which entails like an interpreter that maybe postpones interpretation, the expectation of a usable claim, an actual fragment, etc. And I think we're working towards that. I think that's for me as well what a contextual claim is.
Yeah, no, but I think we need to determine whether our definition of system claim includes
contextual claims. So no, I don't think our current definition doesn't.
Our current definition doesn't. And I'm saying we need something that allows either contextual or standalone claims as system claims.
Probably.
That's probably
so the superset of the different types. But then the question is, do we have user stories for those like that? Because if this abstraction, I mean, I'm all on board if there's user stories to that you don't want to make a difference whether you're adding a contextual claim or a usable claim. If
the reason I want this abstract class, it's because these will be what will be equated in the equivalence class. The equivalence class will contain either.
So, okay, your point is that there's an equivalence clause between contextual claims and usable claims. I'm not certain of that, but I'll think on that. Maybe that's a good exercise for next meeting.
Okay, excellent.
I mean, yes, if there's an equivalence clause on this abstraction, of course, the abstraction needs a name. 100% on board.
I'm a view is forming in my head about, or an opinion on this, which is standalone claim, like you said, is a claim that has all the information there that you need to know to agree or disagree. Contextual claims require an interpretation. It's like this thing can be interpreted as a standalone claim. And I think that one of the reasons I object to images and things like that as being a format acceptable for a standalone claim is I think an image always requires interpretation. And so I interpret this image as this declarative sentence or something with these definitions or whatever. So that's some food for thought, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that the contextual claim is most likely to need an interpretation, but it could happen to be expressed as a standalone, even if it came from a context. And the standalone claim,
No. Can you repeat?
No, one second.
What do you mean by that?
What I'm saying is, it's not because a claim comes from somewhere that it was not expressed in a standalone way. I could find a standalone claim in a text and extract it, and it's been a contextual claim.
Are you shifting the meaning of standalone claim as we define it now?
Am I?
I think you are.
I'm not sure. Oh yeah, I think you may. I may be. Yeah. Okay, let me replace standalone here by non-indexical.
Yes, I think that works.
But the other thing I was going to say is, I just want to make sure we agree that even a non-indexical standalone claim might be subject to interpretation. I mean, the goal of a standalone claim is it won't need interpretation, or that the interpretation will be well-defined, but it can happen afterwards.
Let me rephrase what I think you're trying to say. You're trying to say that a fragment can be a non-indexical claim.
Could happen.
But it's
That's
still a
the first
fragment at that point.
Yep.
Even if the fragments, however we store that, and if you can copy paste essentially the contribution of a fragment and the interpretation to I think close to what we have is a usable claim, if that's the same representation, if you will, the creation of the usable claim or the fragment, I would argue it's still useful to conceptually talk of a fragment and a usable claim.
I would agree. I would agree. But yes, I'm saying it could happen that the fragment happens to have the same.
Yes, representation and a usable. Yes, fully on board. Yes. That's essentially what happens. To take a concrete example, if there's
and the other thing is, even a usable claim may have interpretations, which I think we agreed with before. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, according to your definition of general to specific.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think we're somewhat aligning on contextual claim. Maybe next Wednesday we can try to write up based on these discussions a definition for contextual claim.
Yep, I think so too.
Okay.
I gotta go.
See you next week.
See you next week.
See you. Bye.
Bye.